Texas, 1946. The morning sun broke through the dust as military trucks rolled onto the Kemper Ranch, engines dying into silence that hung thick over cattle country. The creak of metal, the shuffle of boots on dry earth, the low wind pushing through mesquite. 28-year-old Liesl Hartman stepped down from the truck bed, her faded gray Wehrmacht nurse's uniform stained from weeks of transport, her hands still steady despite the exhaustion carved into her face. She had been told Americans were vengeful, that prisoners would be worked to death in desert camps, that mercy was a word the victors didn't know. The foreman approached on horseback, dismounted without urgency, and handed her a tin cup of water. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Ma'am, you'll be working the garden and stables." Liesl blinked. No chains, no shouting, just a weathered man with kind eyes who spoke to her like she was still human. She drank the water slowly, cold and clean, while behind him the ranch stretched endlessly under impossible blue skies. Horses grazed beyond wooden fences. A windmill turned lazily in the distance. Everything felt wrong because nothing felt cruel. The other prisoners whispered nervously, but Liesl noticed something else. The foreman's hands, scarred and deliberate, the way he touched his horse's neck with the same gentleness he'd offered her. She had expected punishment. She had expected to pay for a war she never wanted, but standing in the soft heat of a Texas morning, holding an empty cup from an enemy who treated her with dignity, Liesl felt something crack inside her carefully built armor. This wasn't the America she'd been warned about. This was something far more dangerous. This was mercy she didn't know how to carry. Before we dive in, hit subscribe for more buried stories where history hid the humanity that mattered most, and comment your city and time. We love seeing where these untold accounts reach. The convoy of military trucks kicked up clouds of pale dust as they rolled through the ranch gate, diesel engines coughing and sputtering before falling silent one by one. Inside the lead vehicle, Liesl Hartman sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching America pass through gaps in the canvas, endless sky, endless land, a kind of freedom that seemed almost violent in its vastness. She had crossed an ocean in the hold of a transport ship, spent 3 weeks in a processing camp in New Jersey where the walls pressed close and the air tasted of disinfectant, and now here she was in Texas, where the horizon stretched so far it made her chest ache. 7 women and 15 men climbed down from the trucks, their boots hitting dry earth that puffed into dust with each step. They wore the same faded gray uniforms, the same hollow expressions of people who had stopped expecting kindness weeks ago. Liesl adjusted the wool jacket that hung loose on her frame. She had lost weight since capture, since the field hospital outside Cherbourg, where American soldiers had found her treating their own wounded alongside German casualties. A local crowd had gathered along the fence line, maybe 40 people from the nearest town. Some faces showed simple curiosity, the way you might watch circus animals being unloaded. Others held something harder. A woman in a floral dress spat toward the trucks, the gesture more sad than threatening. A man with gray stubble held a hand-painted sign that read, "No mercy for Nazis," in uneven letters. Liesl understood. She would have felt the same if their positions were reversed. The Kemper Ranch spread out before them like something from the Western films she had watched in Munich before the war, before everything turned to ash and blood. Wooden fences stretched toward distant hills. Cattle moved in lazy clusters, their hides glossy in the morning sun. Windmills turned with patient rhythm, pulling water from deep earth. The main house stood 2 stories tall, white paint peeling but dignified, surrounded by cottonwood trees that offered shade in a landscape hungry for it. Barns and outbuildings clustered nearby, stables, a bunkhouse, storage sheds with tin roofs that gleamed like mirrors. It was beautiful in a way that made Liesl angry, because beauty felt like a betrayal when you had spent months watching people die in mud. A man sat on horseback near the main gate, watching the trucks empty with the stillness of someone who had learned patience the hard way. Jack Kemper was 34, but looked older, his face weathered by sun and something internal that carved lines around his eyes. He wore denim and a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a tan hat shadowing his features. The horse beneath him, a palomino with a coat like polished brass, shifted its weight, and Jack's hand moved to its neck with unconscious gentleness. Liesel noticed his right leg, the way he favored it slightly when he finally dismounted. A war wound, she thought. We all carry them now. The camp commander, a crisp officer named Dawson, read the work assignments from a clipboard while an interpreter translated into German. The male prisoners would handle fence repair, hay baling, heavy construction. The women would work the vegetable gardens, tend the chicken coops, help in the kitchens, muck the stables. Back-breaking labor, all of it. But Liesel had worked harder. She had performed surgery by candlelight in a bunker while artillery shook dirt from the ceiling. She had carried wounded soldiers through snow that came up to her knees. This, at least, would not require her to choose who lived and who died. The local ranch hands made their feelings clear from the first hour. They worked alongside the prisoners but never spoke to them, their silence more cutting than insults would have been. One man, Carl, someone called him, made a point of spitting whenever he passed Liesel, his eyes full of something that looked like grief wearing anger's mask. She did not. Blame him. His brother probably died on a beach somewhere, shot by men who wore the same uniform she had worn. The work was relentless. Texas in late spring felt like standing too close to an oven, the sun pressing down until sweat soaked through clothing and dust caked on skin turned to mud. They baled hay until their hands bled through the work gloves. They stretched barbed wire between fence posts while the metal burned their palms. They shoveled manure and carried water and pulled weeds from garden rows that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Liesel worked without complaint, her medical training having taught her how to ignore her body's protests, how to push through exhaustion by thinking of it as just another kind of surgery, cut away the weakness, stitch yourself back together, keep moving. During the afternoon water break, Liesel found herself near the main stable. The palomino stood in a paddock nearby, its coat gleaming like poured honey. The horse watched her with dark, intelligent eyes, and something in Liesel's chest loosened slightly. Horses did not care about uniforms or flags or which side of a war you had fought on. Horses only cared if you were gentle or rough, honest or false. She took a step toward the fence, her hand rising almost of its own will, drawn by muscle memory from childhood, her father's stable in Bavaria, the smell of hay and leather, Sunday mornings when the world was still whole. Then she caught herself and pulled back, remembering what she was now. A prisoner. The enemy. Someone who had forfeited the right to simple pleasures like touching a beautiful horse on a warm afternoon. On the third day, Liesel collapsed in the south field 3 miles from the ranch house. They had been clearing stones from a pasture, work that required constant bending and lifting under a sun that felt personal in its cruelty. She felt the dizziness coming, tried to push through it the way she had pushed through everything else, but her legs simply stopped obeying and she went down into the dust. The other prisoners were too far away to notice. She lay there watching the sky wheel overhead, thinking distantly that this would be a stupid way to die. Not from bullets or bombs, but from simple heat in a place that felt like peace. She heard hoofbeats before she saw him. Jack Kemper rode up and dismounted in one fluid motion despite his bad leg, his shadow falling across her face and blocking the merciless sun. He could have radioed for the truck. He could have left her there as punishment for weakness. Instead, he knelt beside her, checked her pulse with practiced fingers, and made a decision that would change both their lives. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing now and placed her on Copper's back before climbing up behind her. His arm came around her waist to hold the reins, steady and impersonal, and they rode back toward the ranch house in silence, broken only by the horse's breathing and the creak of leather. Liesel leaned back against his chest because she had no strength left to sit upright, and felt his heart beating against her shoulder blade, slow and steady as a drum. She thought about the American pilot she had hidden in her clinic in Germany, the boy with red hair who called her ma'am and thanked her for the bandages. She thought about the Gestapo officer who shot him in the head while she watched. She thought about how kindness had become the most dangerous thing in the world, because once you showed it, you could never take it back, and once you received it, you could never forget that you had been seen as human by someone who had every right to see you as less. That night in the women's barracks, Liesel lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling while the others slept. Her hand still remembered the warmth of the horse's coat. Her back still remembered the feeling of being held by someone who had chosen mercy when cruelty would have been easier. And somewhere deep in her chest, in a place she thought the war had burned clean, something began to hurt in a new way. Not the pain of punishment, which she understood, but the pain of grace, which terrified her. Jack Kemper started watching Liesel differently after the day he carried her back from the South Field, though he would not have admitted it even to himself. It was not anything improper, he was not that kind of man, and she was still the enemy, still a prisoner under his watch. But something had shifted in the way he noticed things. The way she organized the chaotic tack room without being asked, hanging bridles by size and coiling ropes with the precision of someone trained in medicine. The way she moved through the vegetable garden like she was performing surgery, removing weeds with careful deliberation, never damaging the plants she meant to save. The way she stood a little straighter when she thought no one was looking, as if dignity was a muscle she had to exercise or risk losing forever. He began assigning her to lighter work, the chicken coop instead of fence repair, the garden instead of the hayfields. It was a small mercy, and he told himself it was practical, that she had already collapsed once and he could not afford to lose workers to heat stroke. But the other prisoners noticed, and Carl Henderson noticed most of all. Carl cornered Jack by the equipment shed on a Thursday morning, his face red from more than just the sun. His hands were clenched at his sides, and his voice came out tight and controlled, the way angry men speak when they are trying not to shout. "You going soft on the enemy, Jack?" he said, and the question hung in the air between them like something with weight. Jack took his time answering, the way he did with most things, letting the silence stretch until it became its own kind of response. "She collapsed doing our work," he said finally, his voice level and firm. "That's on me. I'm responsible for these people while they're here, and I won't have anyone dying on my watch, because I wanted to prove a point." Carl's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "My brother died at Normandy. Tommy. You remember Tommy?" Jack nodded slowly. He remembered a kid with a quick smile who used to help with the horses before he enlisted. "I remember," Jack said. "And I'm sorry, but she wasn't at Normandy, Carl. She was running a field hospital in France, treating whoever came through the door." Carl spat into the dust and walked away without another word, but Jack could feel the weight of his anger like a hand pressed against his chest. That night, alone in his room above the barn, Jack lay awake and thought about Iwo Jima. About the Japanese boy soldier who could not have been more than 16, who Jack had shot as the kid came out of a cave with his hands up, too scared or too shocked to drop his rifle. About how Jack had held him as he died, this child who had called out for his mother in a language Jack did not understand but recognized in his bones. About how killing that boy had been the right thing to do according to the rules of war, and how that fact had not made it any easier to live with. The small dignities began appearing without discussion, like gifts left by someone who did not want to be thanked. A canteen of cold water waiting by the garden gate in the early morning, beaded with condensation. A pair of work gloves that actually fit Liesel's small hands, worn but serviceable, left folded on the fence post where she kept her tools. An apple, red and perfect, placed on the windowsill of the chicken coop where she took her lunch break. Liesel understood what these things meant. Not romance, nothing so simple or dangerous as that, but acknowledgement. She had been seen not as a category or a uniform, but as a person who got thirsty and whose hands got blistered, and who might appreciate something sweet after a morning of hard work. She responded in the only language available to her, the language of careful attention. She mended a tear in Jack's saddle blanket with stitches so small and precise they were almost invisible. She organized the chaos of the equipment shed, grouping tools by function and hanging them where they could be easily reached. She left wildflowers in a tin cup by the barn entrance, nothing fancy, just black-eyed Susans and Indian paintbrush gathered from the field margins, a small insistence that beauty still existed in a world that had tried very hard to convince her otherwise. One evening near sunset, as Liesel brushed Copper's coat in the stable another light-duty Jack had assigned her, she heard boots on the wooden floor behind her. She did not turn around, just kept working the brush in long, steady strokes while her heart beat faster in her chest. Jack leaned against the stall door, his hat in his hands, and watched her work for a long moment before speaking. "You know horses," he said, and it was not quite a question. Liesel paused in her brushing, then resumed. "My father had a stable," she said quietly. "Before." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with everything it contained. "Before what?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. "Before everything," Liesel said, and her voice was so soft he almost missed it. She set down the brush and turned to face him, her hands folded in front of her like a schoolgirl called to account. "He raised Hanoverians, warm-blooded horses for dressage and show jumping. I learned to ride before I learned to read." Jack nodded, understanding more than she had said. He had seen it in the way she moved around the horses, the unconscious confidence of someone who had grown up with animals, who knew their language better than she knew human speech. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken war, the things they had both seen, the choices they had both made, the people they had both failed to save. But it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who recognized something in each other, some shared understanding that words would only diminish. Jack made a decision that he knew would cost him, but he made it anyway because some things mattered more than safety. "Sunday," he said. "Dawn. I'm riding out to check the north pasture. You can come with me if you want." He said it like an afterthought, like it was no big thing, but they both knew what it meant. Liesel felt her breath catch in her chest. The other prisoners would see it as collaboration, as betraying whatever solidarity existed among the defeated. The Americans would see it as fraternization, as Jack crossing a line that was supposed to remain sacred. Commander Dawson had regulations about this kind of thing, rules written by men in Washington who had never tried to hold on to their humanity while surrounded by people determined to strip it away. But something in Liesel, the part that remembered galloping through Bavarian meadows with her hair flying loose, the part that had survived the Eastern Front by holding tight to small moments of grace, needed this more than she needed safety. "Yes," she whispered, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff with no certainty of landing. Jack nodded once, settled his hat back on his head, and walked out of the stable without looking back. Liesel stood alone in the gathering dusk, one hand still resting on Copper's warm flank, and understood that she had just agreed to something that would test them both. Outside, the last light caught the windmills and turned them gold, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out to the coming night. Dawn came to the ranch the way it always did, quiet and gradual, the darkness pulling back like a curtain to reveal the world piece by piece. Liesel was already awake when Jack knocked softly on the barracks door, had been awake for hours, lying on her bunk and watching the window square slowly fill with gray light. She slipped out without waking the other women, grateful for their exhaustion, and found Jack waiting by the stable with Copper already saddled. He did not say good morning or ask if she had slept. He simply nodded toward the horse and offered his hand to help her mount, his palm calloused and warm against hers for the brief moment it took to swing herself up. Then he climbed up behind her, his arm coming around her waist to take the reins, and they rode out into the cool morning with nothing but the sound of hoofbeats and the leather creaking in rhythm with Copper's stride. They moved through the ranch gate and onto the open prairie, leaving behind the buildings and fences and all the structures that marked human claims on the land. The sunrise painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, colors so vivid they seemed almost violent after months of gray transport ships and gray camps and gray uniforms. Liesel felt something loosen in her chest, some tightness she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. The air smelled of sage and dust and something green she could not name, and for the first time since capture she took a full breath that did not feel like it might break her. Jack rode in comfortable silence, guiding Copper with subtle shifts of his weight that the horse understood without question. As they moved deeper into the rangeland, he began pointing out landmarks with quiet words that felt like gifts. The creek where he had learned to swim as a boy, shallow and clear over smooth stones. The ridge where his father was buried, marked by a simple wooden cross that faced the sunrise. The ruins of an old mission where his mother still went to pray on Sundays, adobe walls slowly returning to the earth they came from. He was not just showing her the land, he was showing her that even in war's shadow, even after everything that had burned and broken, there were still places where continuity mattered, where the past held hands with the present and promised something like a future. Liesl found herself speaking without meaning to, words rising up from some place she had kept locked tight for months. She told him about medical school in Munich, about staying up all night studying anatomy by candlelight because electricity was rationed, about her father's stables and the Hanoverian mare named Greta who would follow her around like a dog, about her dream of becoming a surgeon, of using her hands to put broken things back together, of building instead of destroying. She stopped short of the war, could not yet speak about the field hospital or the American pilot or the things she had witnessed on the Eastern Front. But Jack seemed to understand the shape of what she was not saying, the way you can see the outline of something even in darkness. They crested a low hill and Copper stopped of his own accord, as if he knew this was a place for pausing. The land spread out before them in all directions, rolling and endless, dotted with cattle and mesquite and the occasional windmill turning against the sky. Jack was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, lower, like he was confessing something. Iwo Jima, he said. I was there for 3 weeks before I took shrapnel in the leg, but that's not what stays with me. Liesl waited, sensing he needed the silence to continue. There was a Japanese soldier, Jack said. Just a kid, really. Maybe 17. He came out of a cave with his hands up, but he was still holding his rifle, probably too scared to think straight. I shot him. It was the right call. You don't take chances in combat. But then I went to him and he was dying slow and he kept calling out for someone. His mother, I think. I don't know Japanese, but I know that sound. I held him until he stopped. Jack's arm around Liesl's waist tightened slightly, not in desire, but in the need to hold on to something solid. I see him every night, he said, every single night, and I keep thinking he was somebody's son, somebody's boy who used to be small and safe and loved, and I took that away because men in offices somewhere decided we should kill each other. Liesl felt tears on her face before she knew she was crying. I see them too, she said quietly. All of them. The ones I saved and the ones I couldn't. The American pilot I tried to hide. The soldiers on the Eastern Front who died calling for God or their mothers or just the pain to stop. I see all of them. In that moment on the hilltop, they were not enemies. They were not even soldier and prisoner. They were two people who had been hollowed out by violence they had not chosen, seeking absolution they were not sure existed, trying to believe that mercy was possible in a world that had given them every reason to embrace hardness instead. Jack did something then that changed everything between them. He dismounted and turned to face Liesl, and his eyes were clear and steady despite what he had just confessed. Go ahead, he said, offering her the reins. Really ride, like you used to. Liesl stared at him, not understanding. This was against every rule, every regulation Commander Dawson had outlined. Prisoners did not ride unaccompanied. Prisoners did not get freedom, not even for 5 minutes, not even on an empty prairie where the nearest fence was a mile away. I trust you, Jack said simply, and those 3 words hit Liesl harder than any accusation or punishment ever had. She took the reins with shaking hands, felt Jack's grip on her waist release, felt him step back and give her space. Then she touched her heels to Copper's sides and the horse leaped forward like he had been waiting for this his whole life. She galloped across the open plain with the wind tearing at her hair and the sun warm on her face, and for 3 minutes she was not a prisoner or a nurse or a German or a woman who had watched people die for causes she did not believe in. She was just a girl on a horse under an impossible sky, and the world was huge and wild and full of room to breathe. When she finally circled back and dismounted, she was crying openly, tears streaming down her face while she laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. Jack stood where she had left him, watching with something like satisfaction in his expression. "Thank you," Liesel managed to say, though the words felt too small for what had just happened. Jack just nodded and took the reins, and they rode back toward the ranch in silence, both of them understanding that what had passed between them could not be spoken about, could not be examined too closely, or it would crumble under the weight of everything arrayed against it. But Carl Henderson had been watching from the equipment shed with binoculars, his face dark with anger and something like betrayal. By the time they reached the ranch, he was already in Commander Dawson's office, filing a report that would change everything. Commander Dawson summoned Jack to his office that same afternoon, and the conversation was brief and cold in the way military conversations become when regulations have been violated. Carl's report sat on the desk between them, typed up with bureaucratic precision, times, locations, specific infractions. Fraternization with enemy prisoners, allowing unsupervised operation of ranch equipment, potential security breach. The words were clinical, but the implications were clear. Jack stood at attention out of old habit, though he was a civilian now and owed Dawson nothing beyond the terms of their labor contract. "I won't insult you by asking if it's true," Dawson said, his voice tired rather than angry. "Carl had binoculars. He saw the whole thing." Jack said nothing, just kept his eyes fixed on a point above Dawson's head, the way soldiers learn to do when being dressed down. "You know the rules, Kemper. You signed the same papers I did. No fraternization, no special treatment. These people are prisoners of war, not guests at a dude ranch." Dawson rubbed his temples like his head hurt. "I'm reassigning Hartman Defense Detail with the male prisoners. Hard labor, full sun, no exceptions, and you'll maintain a minimum distance of 20 yards at all times unless work directly requires otherwise." Jack's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." As he turned to leave, Dawson spoke again, and his voice was gentler now, almost sympathetic. "For what it's worth, I understand. I do. But the rules exist for a reason, and I can't look the other way. Not with Carl watching like a hawk. Not with half the town already suspicious that we're too soft on these people." Liesel worked fence detail for 4 days straight, and the Texas sun showed no mercy. The work involved stretching new barbed wire between posts, a job that required strength and endurance and left hands bloody even through thick gloves. The male prisoners worked alongside her, their faces carefully neutral, understanding that she had somehow fallen from grace, but not knowing why. Jack watched from a distance, always maintaining that 20-yard buffer, and the space between them felt like a physical ache. He wanted to bring her water, to check that she was managing the heat, to tell her he was sorry for setting her up for this fall. But he did nothing, because doing nothing was the only option left to him, and that helplessness burned worse than any wound he had taken at Iwo Jima. On the 4th day, Liesel caught her hand badly on a barbed wire strand, a long, deep gash across her palm that welled up with blood immediately. She wrapped it in her shirt and kept working because stopping meant showing weakness, and weakness meant losing whatever dignity she had left. But by nightfall, the wound had dirt in it, and by the next morning, infection had set in, turning the skin around the cut red and hot to the touch. The camp medic, a disinterested corporal who had failed out of medical school and resented his posting, gave her 2 aspirin and a dirty bandage, told her to keep it clean, and sent her back to work. Liesel knew better. She had training enough to recognize sepsis in its early stages, understood that without proper care she could lose the hand or worse. But she said nothing, just took the aspirin and went back to the fence line, because what else was there to do? By the 2nd morning of the infection, Liesel had a fever. She could feel it in the way her thoughts moved too slowly, the way her vision narrowed at the edges, the way her legs felt both heavy and disconnected from her body. She stumbled carrying a coil of wire, caught herself, kept moving. The male prisoners noticed and exchanged worried looks but did not speak. They had their own survival to think about. Jack saw her stumble from across the field, saw the way she moved like someone underwater, and something in him broke cleanly in half. He crossed the distance at a run despite his bad leg, caught her as she started to go down, and lifted her in his arms like she weighed nothing at all. Carl shouted something from the equipment shed, but Jack ignored him, walking straight to his truck and settling Liesel in the passenger seat. She was barely conscious, her forehead burning against his hand when he checked it. He started the engine and drove toward town, knowing with complete certainty that he was destroying everything he had built here and not caring at all. Commander Dawson's Jeep caught up with them 3 miles down the road, lights flashing. Jack pulled over but did not get out, just sat with his hands on the wheel while Dawson approached. "Step out of the vehicle, Kemper," Dawson said, and his voice was hard now, all the sympathy gone. Jack climbed out slowly, keeping himself between Dawson and the truck. "She needs a real doctor," he said simply. "Your medic gave her aspirin for an infected wound. She'll lose the hand if someone doesn't treat it properly." Dawson looked past Jack at Liesl slumped in the passenger seat, her face flushed with fever, and something complicated moved across his expression. "The regulations are clear," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I'm taking her to Doc Morrison in town," Jack said, and it was not a question or a request. "You can relieve me of duty, you can report me to whoever you need to report me to, but I'm not leaving her with a medic who doesn't know sepsis from a splinter." They stood there in the dust with the sun beating down, and the moment stretched out between them, a test of what mattered more, rules or righteousness, procedure or mercy. Finally, Dawson stepped back. "Go," he said quietly. "Get her treated. But when you come back, we're going to have a conversation, and it won't end well for you." Jack nodded, climbed back in the truck, and drove. Doc Morrison was an old man who had practiced medicine for 40 years and had seen every kind of human stupidity. So he asked no questions, just cleaned and debrided the wound while Liesl bit down on a leather strap and tears ran silently down her face. He gave her a shot of penicillin and proper bandages and told Jack to bring her back in 3 days. By the time they got back to the ranch, Commander Dawson was waiting with formal papers. "You're relieved of duty effective immediately," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "The contract between the U.S. Army and Kemper Ranch is terminated. The prisoners will be reassigned to another facility within 48 hours. Jack took the papers without reading them. "Yes, sir," he said. That night, with Liesl recovering in the women's barracks and Jack packing his belongings in the room above the barn, they both understood that the cost of mercy had come due, and neither of them regretted paying it. Before dawn the next morning, the transport trucks arrived to move the prisoners. Jack stood by the fence as Liesl was led toward the vehicles, her hand properly bandaged now, her fever broken. She turned to look at him one last time, and he raised his hand. Not a wave, but an acknowledgement, a quiet statement that what had passed between them mattered, that she had been seen and valued, that mercy was real even when it cost everything. Then she climbed into the truck and the canvas fell closed, and Jack stood alone in the gray light with the knowledge that he had lost his position and his reputation and his place in the community, and that somehow, impossibly, he had never felt more at peace. 6 months passed like water through cupped hands, each day blending into the next until Jack could barely remember what it felt like to wake up with purpose. He found work as a day laborer, moving from ranch to ranch, doing whatever needed doing, mending fences, breaking horses, clearing brush. The pay was decent and the work was honest, but he was no longer the foreman, no longer the man people looked to for decisions. He had become just another hired hand, and the town treated him with a careful distance that was somehow worse than outright hostility. They did not spit at him the way they had spit at the prisoners, but they did not invite him to Sunday dinners either, did not ask him to sit on the church steps after service and talk about cattle prices and weather. He had broken an unspoken rule. He had shown mercy to the enemy, and that made him suspect in ways that were hard to name but easy to feel. Yet when Jack lay in his rented room above the feed store at night, listening to trucks rumble past on the highway, he felt something he had not felt since before Iwo Jima. He could sleep. The Japanese boy soldier still visited his dreams sometimes, but the nightmares had lost their sharp edges, as if choosing to save Liesl had somehow balanced a scale he did not know he was keeping. He had spent years trying to atone for taking a life by following rules and doing his duty and being the man his country needed him to be. But in the end, atonement had come not from obedience but from defiance, not from strength but from surrender to what he knew was right regardless of cost. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late spring, forwarded through the Red Cross with stamps from 3 different countries. Jack's hands shook slightly as he opened it, careful not to tear the thin paper that had traveled so far to find him. Liesel's handwriting was precise and careful, the letters formed with the same attention to detail she had brought to everything else. She wrote that she was in a displaced persons camp in New Jersey, awaiting final clearance and repatriation to Germany. The investigation into her wartime activities had concluded she had been cleared of war crimes, her record showing nothing but medical service and one arrest by the Gestapo for harboring an enemy soldier. She would be released within the month and sent home to Munich, or what was left of it. She thanked him, but not for the things he expected. Not for the horse ride or the lighter work assignments or even for taking her to the doctor. Instead, she thanked him for reminding her that mercy still existed, even in hearts that had known war. She wrote that she had applied to medical programs in Germany, determined to rebuild what the war had destroyed, to use her hands for healing instead of just stopping the bleeding. And then she told him something that made him have to sit down and read the words 3 times to be sure he understood them correctly. "The day you let me ride alone on that hilltop," she wrote, "that was the day I forgave myself. Not for the war, I will carry that forever, as I should, but for believing I did not deserve to be treated with dignity. You gave me back something I thought was lost. You reminded me I was still human. That is a debt I can never repay, but I will spend my life honoring it." Jack sat at the small desk in his rented room for a long time, the letter held carefully in his hands like something fragile. Then he took out paper and a pen and began to write back, the words coming slowly at first and then faster as he found what he needed to say. He did not ask her to stay. That would have been selfish and impossible besides. He did not confess love, because what they had shared was deeper than romance and simpler than passion. Instead, he told her the truth. "You asked me why I did it," he wrote. "Why I risked everything to show you kindness when I could have just followed the rules and kept my job and my reputation. The truth is, you reminded me why I fought in the first place. Not to win, not to punish, but so people like you, good people caught in bad circumstances, could have a chance to be decent again. You were a prisoner, yes, but you were also a nurse who tried to save an enemy soldier at the cost of your own freedom. You were someone who organized chaos and mended broken things and brought wildflowers to a dusty barn because beauty mattered even when everything was ugly. Go home, Liesel. Heal. Build something good. Teach others to do the same. That is victory enough for me. That is what I fought for, even if I did not know it at the time." 3 weeks after he mailed the letter, Jack received a visitor at the feed store. Margaret Kemper, his mother, climbed the stairs to his room with the slow deliberation of someone who had made a difficult decision and would not be turned away from it. She sat in the only chair and looked at her son with eyes that had seen him through childhood illnesses and teenage foolishness and the hollow-eyed silence he had brought home from the Pacific. "The family met," she said without preamble. "We want you back at the ranch, your position, your room, everything." Jack started to speak, but she held up her hand. Carl apologized. Took him 6 months, but he finally came around. Said his anger was making him see enemies where there were just broken people trying to survive. Said Tommy would have been ashamed of him. She folded her hands in her lap, and Jack saw they were shaking slightly. Doc Morrison wrote a letter to Commander Dawson. Explained that the girl would have lost her hand or worse without proper treatment. Said you made the only decent choice available. Dawson sent it up the chain and they cleared you. Said you showed judgment and moral courage under difficult circumstances. Margaret's voice softened. "You did the right thing, Jack. We all know it now. Come home." Jack went back to the ranch on a Sunday morning when the light was soft and golden, and the land looked the way it had looked his whole life, permanent and forgiving, ready to accept him back without judgment. He returned to his room above the barn, hung his few belongings in the same closet, and went out to check on the horses. Copper whinnied when he saw Jack, trotting over to the fence with his ears forward, and Jack buried his face in the horse's mane and let himself feel the weight of the last 6 months finally lift. That evening, Commander Dawson stopped by with paperwork, making Jack's reinstatement official. They shook hands without speaking much, two men who understood that sometimes mercy and justice could occupy the same space and that following your conscience was worth more than following the rule book when the two came into conflict. 1 year later, on a morning when spring was just beginning to warm into summer, Jack received a package from Germany. Inside was a photograph showing Liesel in a white coat, standing in what looked like a stable beside a beautiful gray horse. Children surrounded her, some in wheelchairs, some on crutches, some with visible scars, all of them touching the horse with careful, wondering hands. On the back, in Liesel's precise handwriting, she had written, "Because of you, I remembered who I was, and now I am teaching them to remember too. This is what mercy builds. This is what your courage made possible." Jack pinned the photograph above his desk in the barn office, where the morning light would catch it first thing every day. That evening, he rode Copper out to the north pasture, the same hilltop where he had once given a German prisoner her freedom for 3 minutes, and he sat in the saddle watching the sun set over endless Texas rangeland. For the first time since the war, Jack felt complete. Not healed, some wounds never fully closed, but whole in a way that mattered more. They tell us to forget, he thought, to move on. But that is wrong. We are supposed to remember not the hate, but the moment we chose differently. That cowboy and that prisoner on that horse, we were more than our uniforms that day. We were proof that even in war's shadow, decency survives. And maybe that is all victory ever really is. One act of mercy that refuses to be forgotten.